Hello and welcome to Business Today Television. I am Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Easynomics. Today we are joined by a very special guest, Richard Rossow, Senior Advisor and Chair on India and Emerging Asia Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. One of the best people that I know who's been tracking India's reform trajectory and business for the past 25 years and more. Richard, thank you very much for taking out the time with us today. We are having this conversation in the backdrop of Business Today's annual India at 100 special edition, and this edition's focus is 100 ideas and suggestions for taking forward the aim of ensuring that India becomes a developed nation by 2047. And I could think of no one better than someone who, like you, who's tracked India's business environment for so many years now. In fact, viewers, he does a 30 reforms tracker, which I have followed for 10, 11 years now. So, Richard, I want to begin by that big question. How is Modi 3.0 performing on the reform front?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks for your kind words about some of the work that we do far away from Washington, D.C., trying to keep an eye on what's happening in wonderful India. I would say so far, we're a year into Modi's third term in government, and when you look at the pace of reforms, whether it's FDI reforms or domestic reforms, it's been the slowest of the three terms so far. The first term, you saw out of the gates a bunch of big reforms, about 40 positive changes to the foreign investment list, some big domestic reforms in the first couple of years, like GST and bankruptcy. The second term was a little bit slow, but when COVID began to hit, the government knew they needed to trigger the economy. You saw some tax cut changes, some other FDI reforms. This time around, it's been relatively quiet. Part of that may be due to the fact that they're now in a coalition government. You've had some changes to key officials in the cabinet. But here we are sitting on the precipice, of course, of the Parliament session convening today. And a couple of big things that are on the horizon, looking at a range of insurance reforms, looking at potentially moving on the civilian nuclear liability law that could change how baseload power operates in India if they're able to move it. So a little bit slow in the third term so far, but hopeful, especially as we sit in front of a new parliament session. Some big things the government has articulated its interest in trying to move ahead, and I certainly hope it's able to.
Why do you think Modi 3.0 has had a slow start when it comes to reforms?
Some of the reasons, I think, again, it could be that you've got a coalition government, although I don't know that would be such a big detractor, because when you look at the main parties that make up the coalition, the Telugu Desam party, which has been probably more reform than any party in India over the last 25 years that I've been tracking it, and even the Janata Dal United in Bihar, which doesn't tend to be a big break on reform. They're more interested in what's happening locally in their state rather than national level politics and governance. So I don't know that they would be a break the way that maybe some of the communist parties or sometimes Trinamool Congress had been on previous governments. So I don't want to chalk too much up to the fact that it's a coalition government. It could be the changes to several cabinet portfolios, the fact that many of these cabinet departments are now run by regional parties that maybe care less about what's happening nationally and internationally, instead more on what's happening back with their home party. But also it's the fact that you've seen a bit of a slowdown as well in some of what Modi wanted to accomplish with competitive cooperative federalism. Now that regional parties have a little bit larger voice in a coalition government, the government, I think maybe to some extent, the union government feels a little bit less able to push states towards reform. So some of the work they've done before on ranking states' business environment slowed down, drafting model laws and regulations for states has slowed down. I'd like to see that get back up again, because really at the end of the day, if more of India's 28 states start pushing on reforms locally within their own jurisdiction, that's when I think the economy really starts to zoom and take off. Because frankly, the union government doesn't actually hold as many of the levers as it used to, because they have decontrolled a lot of parts of the economy where previously they had a dominant role.
Absolutely. Let's take a look at the future and focus on what can and should be done, because viewers, like I said at the top of this show, Business Today has put together 100 ideas, and an expert like Richard Rossow would help us understand what we need. What is really needed for the future, Richard, for India to do? what can be a winning strategy for the Indian nation when it comes to the 2047 goals?
Well, I think probably the best news from somebody who's been tracking how India reforms and how politics works, the best news that I can provide is the fact that there's going to be a natural flow towards modernization and reform. And that's going to be because in this period between now and India's 100th birthday, you're going to have that spark when suddenly Indian states change from being driven politically by rural voters to urban voters. Right now, cities in India tend to be the last things that state governments think about when they think about what are their main political priorities for the year ahead. So you see cities like Bangalore that are, growing explosively as much as business can, but choked so much by the lack of investment by the state. Similar with other big economic capitals like Gurgaon. And when suddenly cities become the dominant political force, when urbanization takes root and you've actually got more than half of voters in Indian states that are living in cities, the big drivers, that's when I think suddenly this lean towards modernization and reform begins to take place. Of course, you want to make sure that you're not pulling back things that provide subsistence living for farmers, who still demand free electricity, free water. That's going to have to be balanced a little bit more. But that to me is like a natural flow that you can actually count and track. And you know that suddenly the drivers on state political economies is going to change pretty dramatically. A second and very much related thing is empowering cities. Right now there's a mayor of Bangalore, and not many people pay a lot of attention to mayoral races. There's not a lot of authority that mayors have. And yet that's going to change as well when cities get a lot more power and authority. So improving governance of cities, expanding the budgets of cities, that's something the finance minister and the Reserve Bank of India, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development are working on very thoughtfully right now, because you want to make sure you don't want to empower cities after they already become the drivers of political economy in Indian states. You want to make sure they've got stronger tools even in advance of when that day arrives. So I'd say, like, as I mentioned before, on getting states to compete more effectively for winning business. But I think urbanization between now and 2047 is going to be the big driver. And I think city governance, when that city suddenly become the drivers for reform, that's when I think everything starts clicking. Some of it happens naturally, and some of it's got to be done by the government.
Richard, I'm assuming from your answer that you believe that this is going to be one of the top trends. Would you be able to pick up a couple more that you think are going to be equally important?
Yeah, well, India is going to become one of the largest economies in the world, and the world's going to be paying a lot of attention. And so therefore, I think improving India's openness on trade and investment is going to be important in that period as well. India wants to become that next best investment destination apart from China, that China plus one, or maybe even taking China's place as one of the global hubs in manufacturing. And that's going to take a lot of changes, both in terms of how India looks at its trade policy. Right now, still remains relatively protectionist. That's something that you saw, especially during the Modi government's first term, when you saw regular tariff increases. You saw other big changes like domestic manufacturing rules and such. Being forced to manufacture for some companies is it actually kind of deters them from thinking bigger about India, because you want to be able to test the market. But on foreign investment as well, foreign companies still don't always feel as welcome as they probably could. And you see this when you still got a foreign investment schedule that's got literally almost 36 sectors where you got foreign investment limitations, whether it's FDI caps or maybe other regulations that impair foreign investors versus domestic competitors. So India is about to pass both Japan and Germany to become the world's third largest economy. And that's only going to continue to grow. I mean, when we talk about India in 2047, it's going to be one of the world's three economies that are $10 trillion or more, along with China and the United States. So there's a natural lean for companies to invest and expand their operations with India, and trying to ensure that India remains as open as it possibly can be, both for trade and investment, is going to be vitally important. You've got other big things that have to be ironed out. Right now the power grids still don't function very effectively. You've only got 3 states in India, Gujarat, Haryana, and Odisha, where you've got high functioning power grids. The other states still have a lot of work to do, water and sanitation. So a lot of other challenges that India has to overcome. Some of that is going to be borne by the union government, a lot of that again by states. But to me, I'd say India's openness to trade and investment is one of those main drivers, because you've seen countries like China that have really turned the corner. A lot of that has been based by connectivity with international markets.
You picked on the next question that I had in mind, and I want to take that forward by getting you to tell our viewers which states do you think are performing. In the context of power grids, you spoke about 3 states. And which states do you think need to sort of step up from their current state? What would you say at the state level?
Yeah. Well, at the start, you're always going to have political transition. But the good news on the state front is that you do have a little bit more stability. If you look back 30 years, state governments had about a 1 in 4 re-election rate. And when state governments change, there are times when you see dramatic disruptions, when they throw out everything the previous government had done. They try to do new things and different things. I would say notably 6 years ago in Andhra Pradesh, when the YSR Congress government came in, they tried to revoke the power purchase agreements of the previous Naidu government. They changed the thinking about this national capital. When you see disruptions of that magnitude in core functions of how a state operates, that spooks investors. They don't want to make investments in that because it looks like it's going to be an unstable policy environment that you don't know year to year what it's going to look like. And so that kind of stability. But states that have relatively a good track record of encouraging investment, Gujarat would be up near the top of the list. They did big reforms in the power grids, very welcoming to foreign investors, domestic investors as well. You see Tamil Nadu, they haven't figured out exactly, some of their core constraints on water and electric power, but they try to find workarounds to provide that welcoming environment. They got a great workforce there as well and port facilities. So Gujarat and Tamil Nadu tend to stand out. Maharashtra, because of the economic magnitude of the state, with those dynamos of Mumbai and Pune, you can't ignore Maharashtra, even if sometimes they're not always leading on policy the same way that some of the other states are. A couple of the up-and-comers, though, I do think if Chandrababu Naidu can stick around in Andhra for a longer period of time, he's always been such an economic visionary. The dynamos you've got in the south of Bangalore and Hyderabad are important. Odisha is one that I keep a close eye on as well. Again, fixing some of the core constraints like electric power, which the previous Patnaik government had done, tells me that Odisha, which not as many people pay attention to, but it's a coastal state. They've got well-functioning power grids. They got a lot of land availability and a decent workforce, so and some basic industries. So I know that's a lot of answers to a short question, but Gujarat and Tamil Nadu seem to be the two that are really in the lead. Maharashtra is undeniably large. But the second part of your question, which are the states that have to catch up? I mean, that's the two biggies, right? I mean, UP and Bihar. I mean, those two combined have over 300 million people. Right? That's larger than most countries when you look at the two. And UP has got some elements of success, a few urban areas that have done relatively okay. And you see the current government, the Adityanath government, trying to encourage foreign investment, these defense corridors, trying to connect the big cities together. Bihar still seems to be a laggard. I'm a regular visitor to Bihar, and you've got relatively solid governance, roads, bridges, but the last 10 years, a lot less impetus on big reforms and big ideas, and not a lot of investment coming in. So a few of the big states, if you want to have all boats rise, it's got to be led by the big states. And of India's big states, UP and Bihar still remain the two big laggards, and probably Bihar a little bit further behind than UP.
And in the 7 names, viewers, that Richard has shared with us, lies the answer to unlocking's future economic potential. Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, UP and Bihar. So that's a great snapshot of what's happening at the states, and India is ultimately a union of the states. I want to come back to an earlier point and circle back on the issue that you made. And the question I had at that stage was, the economic model that we still seem to be sort of grappling with in terms of how we do it. We've seen how the Modi government has kind of had progressed on the implementation and the ideation part for the past decade or so. Competing with China, this is one of the key questions that you can have when it comes to a reform and macroeconomy discussion in India. Do you seriously think that there is scope to compete on some of the areas that China has massive strength, including on manufacturing, for example, Richard?
Yeah, it's still the distance to frontier on India manufacturing across most industries being competitive with China is still quite some distance. And that's because China has some advantages, the big investments they made in infrastructure, the implicit and explicit subsidies they make to some of their competitors. which again, market economies like the United States and India can't intervene as heavily as China can. And also the fact that China can force groups to work together. Basically, if they choose a few battery companies to be the national champions, that when you've got such a top-down economic system, they can force those to become the providers of choice for batteries for anybody that's using it, whether it's grids or cars or vehicles, things like that. So there's certain ways that China functions, which are difficult for economies like the United States and India to be able to replicate. Some of those have some inherent danger, and therefore I think that market interventions by the United States, India, and aligned partners to block China's ability to at least dominate certain sectors that have strategic value is in our interest, and that provides an area of opportunity. India has seen success in attracting investments in manufacturing in areas like automotives and pharmaceuticals, where they've got real competitive advantages even against China, and that gives us an idea that it's not impossible to jump up and take advantage. And it's also important to remember that we do talk a lot about manufacturing for obvious reasons, but India already is the workshop to the world when it comes to IT services. And now that companies continue to grow and expand their global capability centers, we sometimes forget this real diamond that India has. They managed to take over in IT services what China was able to do in manufacturing. And I think as more industries start moving deeper and deeper towards R&D, engineering, and thought leadership, the fact that India has that base and will be a design center, you've still got to get more of a trigger on that entrepreneurship bent, where a lot of times India is happy doing work for global companies rather than creating their own IP. And that's got to snap and change. But is the talent, the skill set there in India to become really the engineering design center of the world? Absolutely it is. And companies have already been leveraging that in a significant way. So a few sectors give us some hope. I think some areas that we've got to limit China's ability to dominate globally provide some hope. And the fact that India has got such a dynamic IT service sector and all that engineering talent means that the ability to leapfrog and take advantage is certainly on the table. So those are some elements I look at very, very closely as providing hope and opportunity for India to become that global manufacturing hub, not just simply a major hub on global services.
I put this question to a leading member of Indian industry quite some time ago, and I said, why aren't we able to innovate or do product-led development the kind that China did? And his rather pithy answer, Richard, to me was, well, because we don't steal IP. But let's leave that for some other discussion. I want to come back to the trade point. The world is at a very pivotal moment when it comes to the global trade order. We know what President Trump is doing to it. We also know how India is trying to sort of cope with it and the negotiations that we have. I'm not asking you a question on the here and now, but broadly on the trade front, we saw 10 years of Modi 1 and 2, where a certain kind of philosophy seemed to drive India's engagement and openness to trade deals. We now see that changing. But to serve the objective of India at 2047, what kind of trade architecture should India pursue in your view?
Well, I think looking and some of the work that I think the team at Invest India has done recently is really, really deep and thoughtful in trying to approach this exact same question. You take a product that India wants to be great at, like semiconductors. Semiconductors is actually the culmination of a bunch of different functions and features that different companies do, mining the materials, the research and engineering, the design, the fabrication. And some of those areas, India is already competitive. Others, they're a little bit behind, but able to catch up. And other areas, they're probably a decade or more behind. And so being thoughtful and approaching every product in that kind of a segmented way. What can India do today? What can India do tomorrow? And what is India going to have to import for the next 10 years? The inability to substitute. And then targeting a lot of the subsidies. When you look at PLI programs, when you look at trade policy, with that level of breakdown for different tech products and such, is an important way to kind of approach. And I'm really excited to see some of the work that Invest India has done in taking that segmented approach to the products India wants to be good at. But the second avenue, I would say, and you see a little bit of this starting to creep into how the Modi government's been pursuing manufacturing investment, is looking at basic industries. When India first announced the Make in India program, and a lot of the sectors where you saw some of the initial PLI programs, it was about being explosively great at some of the high-tech areas where India, the distance to frontier is still quite far. India is not even competitive with your neighbor Bangladesh when it comes to ready-made garments and textiles. And that's a big export earner. It's a big job creator. And so far, you don't see that same level of impetus in basic industries like textiles, paper mills, and such. Instead, a lot of the government policy and money is spent on semiconductor fabs and 5G equipment, things like that. So I would like to see, apart from that segmented approach to tech, is also a much bigger push in basic industries, which would be huge job creators and huge export potential. Because I think when you consider some of the barriers India has to entry right now of, weak electric power grids and water and such, sometimes basic industries can deal with those constraints much better than a solar fab or a semiconductor fab. So that's my two thoughts: segmented approach to tech, and then a lot more focus on basic industries, where I think India has a much bigger opportunity to win in the near term.
That's a very good point, and I know that politicians, not just in India, all over the world would be attracted with big headline grabbing projects and massive investments, and that's what sometimes drives emotion. But like you said, it's the simpler stuff that can perhaps provide greater political dividends, because it would be also linked to job creation in the age of AI. What are the low-hanging fruits that India should target, apart from what you just said, that could deliver growth as well as prosperity for the average Indian?
Yeah, that's the great question everybody's always searching for. But I do think something the finance minister has announced about trying to get back to ranking Indian states on their business environment is a great first step. I know it's politically difficult to do sometimes, but it's a must do, and they can do it with stroke of a pen. They don't need votes to be able to do that, so they can, even though it's maybe low hanging fruit might be a bit much to call it, but at least you don't have to take it to a vote in Parliament. A second thing that I think has to happen is this empowering cities. If cities suddenly are able to raise revenue, write bonds, focus on local infrastructure rather than relying on states, because again, for the next 10, 15 years, most states are still going to be driven by farmers as their primary vote bank, not city dwellers. So if cities can ring fence their money, raise more money, make local decisions, and invest in infrastructure at a faster pace than what states are investing in cities, then again, cities becoming those dynamos of growth really begins to take off. And legally, again, there aren't constraints on being able to do that. India's constitution devolves certain powers to cities. Cities have a lot more opportunity to raise revenue than they currently do. They just need to figure out how to get around to be able to do it and improving their own local governance. I do think on the FDI issue, this whole idea about moving instead from a positive list right now, where they lay out the sectors where FDI is allowed, switch it to a negative list. Turn that around so that right now, like, presumption is that investment will be allowed, and only in certain sectors where you've got security concerns or whatever it is, where you'll have limitations, and maybe some countries, of course, will be limitations. But I think switching to a negative list on FDI from the positive list will be a nice shot of a boost to foreign investors. The last thing I'll say, something the finance ministry has been thinking about for quite some time, is a major reconfiguration of how they look at tariffs. Trying to drop down input goods so they're lower than the cost of importing finished goods. Finance minister has announced this multiple times in budget speeches, and you see some small steps in the budget. But I'd like to see, a monster revision made to the customs schedule, so that you do finally see this duty inversion, as they say, where it's cheaper to bring in finished goods than intermediate goods. I'd like to see that swapped out. They've been working on this for quite some time, but to get that across the finish line, I think will really be an impetus to foreign investors to come in and set up India as a global manufacturing hub. So that's a few of the things I think they can do without taking tough votes to Parliament or some of those sometimes insurmountable objections to big reforms.
As we wind down the conversation, viewers, I just want to recap what Richard has just said. He's given me a headline, India that lives in its cities, quite in contrast to what we have all grown up reading, writing and discussing. India lives in its villages. So it's very clear, and Richard has his finger on the pulse, that India is moving to its cities, and therefore that's where all the focus should be on. As we wrap up the conversation, Richard, just one more broader theme to ask you. Looking towards India, What does the rest of the world, particularly the United States, if I may say, need to do with regard to helping in whichever way it can the cause of India's growth? Because vis-a-vis China, you have a country where there are a lot of shared values, and I'm not just talking about the Commonwealth. What can the United States and what should the United States do at this stage, despite what President Trump seems to be doing to the relationship with our country?
Yeah, two ways I'll approach that perfect question. The first is to think about India. If we look at China's explosive growth over the last 25 years, that's been driven so much by becoming the workshop for the world, by its global integration. If China's going to maintain that over long periods of time into the future, which has given it the economic power to invest in Belt and Road and military modernization, these things are not unlinked. China's economic domination of the world has really been the financial impetus for the investments they made in improving their own security situation at our peril. And when I say ours, I mean both the United States and India. And so making sure that India is an alternative that has a strong, vibrant economy that is more bulletproof from China than the United States is right now, it is strongly in our interest, because China's growth in the future, if it's going to look like the past, is going to be driven partially by exporting to India. And again, India's own inclination and drive to try to offset that is certainly strongly in American interest. And so finding ways to support that, is on the table. The second thing, which I think the Biden administration did very well and the Trump administration less well, is looking at the U.S.-India relationship wide scale. It's not just commercial, it's not just security. All this stuff is interlinked. And so with the Biden administration, you saw just after we announced the Inflation Reduction Act of big domestic incentives on solar manufacturing, they also signed 2 checks for almost $1 billion for solar manufacturing in India, which had a lot of people scratching their heads. Why are we doing these domestic support programs, but also investing in India? Similarly, you saw with the White House encouraging U.S. semiconductor firms to invest in India, a lot of these strategic sectors. And that's because we don't look at these things unlinked. The fact that India was doing more with the United States militarily on one hand meant that when India said, we'll work with you militarily, but give us some of the action when it comes to investments in defense, investments in semiconductors, the United States was willing to play ball because, again, you can't unlink these things. So helping India insulate itself from China is strongly in our interest, and that means a stronger U.S.-India economic lane. And looking at the U.S.-India lane larger so that we're not divorcing security cooperation from economic cooperation, that puts a bigger set of negotiating points on the table than just these narrow things we got right now, like a trade deal. And it makes bigger deals possible. So that's the two answers that get to your really great question on how we can try to get this thing right, and we both have a win-win.
A quick follow-up on that. Do you think things are on track? Because the sense that one gets is that perhaps not much progress can be expected on all those very crucial areas that you highlighted. And, apart from trade and many other comments, I think the tilt towards Pakistan is also bothering our establishment in the near term.
Yeah, I'd say those of us standing just a couple of feet outside the White House, too, are scratching our heads a little bit as to why the sudden love affair with Pakistan doesn't make a lot of sense. And I will say, Delhi sometimes kind of overemphasizes what's actually happening here. When you look at the relationships and the relative heft of the two of them, with India, we're talking about trade deals, civilian nuclear cooperation, so many areas, the depth of military interoperability and cooperation. It still is 99-1 when you look at all the things on the table, the level of our trade and investment relationship with India versus Pakistan. But that 1% grows to 2%. And, from Delhi's perspective, it sounds like suddenly it's back to 50-50. I mean, if you were to look and catalog all the areas of cooperation, it's laughable to think that we're treating the two anywhere close to parity, even under Trump. But, it is noticeable. You do see suddenly this love affair you've seen in the past between the United States and Pakistan, which has a lot of us scratching our heads. I can't say I know exactly what to attribute this to. Certainly when you talk to folks across the U.S. government, there's not a lot of people that would be aligned with that kind of thinking. But it is certainly noticeable. I mean, look, at the end of the day, what I mentioned about, when Indian state governments change and you saw a lot of change in policy, well, the United States at the national level is indicative of that right now. India doesn't know from day to day what it's dealing with. I understand the heft of the U.S. Economy to India's economy means that India's got to try to play ball and get something across the finish line. But it is going to be a rocky next couple of years. But do know that, I mean, overall, if you look since Trump came to office, the Quad has been prioritized. The meeting with Prime Minister Modi was prioritized. Some of the first things out of the gates. So big things are still possible, but you got to ride the surfboard because the waves are a little bit higher right now in Washington.
Absolutely. And Richard, that was a wonderful summary because we sometimes tend to look at the near term. But like you said, even if the next 2 years are a bit volatile, a bit rocky, we have to look ahead at the next 2 decades and to really see the potential coming through when it comes to India's goals for 2047. Richard, thank you very much for helping us make sense of the reform agenda and also decode some of the clear agenda points in that regard. As always, thank you very much for your time with us today. Viewers, with that, it's a wrap on this conversation with one of the foremost trackers of India's reform history, Richard Rossow. And this is part of our coverage for the Business Today India at 100 special. We'll come back with more. Until then, goodbye.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.